All right, Mariano and Brian, you are up.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you.
Awesome, great. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Brian Costello. I'm a senior strategist at Matchstick. I'm joined here today by Mariano, senior device engineer at Keytech. Today, you go on to the next slide. Today, we'll briefly talk about foundational methods to confidently freeze complex delivery device architectures. Our goals were to define an optimal dual user and technical de-risking approach to freezing device architectures through systematic foundational methods. Other goals are optimize work streams prior to design controls when it is unclear what the final device architecture should be. That's obviously considering cost, time, and effort. It's a huge concern. And understanding how we can validate this approach as we look at the increases in technology complexity and advancements in technology, and how do we validate that throughout. Next slide, Tony. So it's a busy canvas, but as most device development pathways are quite complex. So I'll try to break this down for you. Where do you start? So when there's an existing product, you start from a risk analysis. And this allows you to understand where there's maybe shortcomings or maybe even analogous benchmarks in the field that you can test as well. Leveraging human factors analysis and heuristic analyses, existing error reports or complaint data, this can all be leveraged as inputs into your research plan. These findings are also drive development of potential architectures that address and engineer out design flaws or issues that are identified. So when you think about the full ecosystem, you need to consider the whole thing before you detail out a research plan. It's necessary to understand the context of use, other products, any system interactions that a device or solution may come in contact with and have to integrate with, and of course, all the stakeholder needs. When we think about pre-formative research into these topics and early concept testing, these are going to help define out the use case scenarios and any value drivers across the different stakeholders. Defining the future benefit trade-offs and stakeholder impact early is critical, but there's often gaps that are needed to be filled to drive prototype creation. So leveraging peer-reviewed literature, social media, clinicians, and even other SMEs can be great ways to accelerate your research agenda. Skipping these steps can lead to erroneous assumptions that only reveal themselves later on in the process, and that could also force suboptimal solutions or even extend timelines and costs. When we think about mixed methods research, these approaches are out there and they've been used, of course, over time, but they're starting to adapt, and ethnography and contextual inquiry, they're starting to evolve with the technology. And using a variety of these tools and other ones to help understand user mental models, prioritization of needs, and even stakeholders' attitudes and beliefs are additional ways that we can help fill in the gaps and establish a strong foundation to build device architectures upon. With a complex ecosystem that these devices fit within and the need to satisfy commercial and business inputs, the clinical inputs, use cases and challenges, and the challenge engineering notions and limitations, it's helpful to break down the research agenda in a way that systematically reduces the risk as you fill in the unknowns as you progress towards architecture freeze. Mariano will now share an engineering perspective as he dives a little bit more into the detail and the technical aspects.
Thank you, Brian. What Brian just described highlights the necessity of building a strong foundation of knowledge and inputs from a holistic understanding of user and stakeholder perspectives. For device developers, this foundation is essential for a fruitful brainstorming and concept generation process, ensuring that constraints and opportunities are identified and understood before investing in short-sighted solutions. In the illustration you see here, we've outlined a method that advances the early device design work systematically from that knowledge building and brainstorming phase through to exploration, integration, and refinement phases, using parallel technical and usability work streams in a complementary way to arrive at architecture freeze confidently. While the overarching principles of good human factors engineering and product design development reflected here are not new, what we have learned in our experience is the unique value of breaking down conceptual features into functional design elements and technical challenges, which can be evaluated independently through a series of pre-formative studies and de-risking experiments. This approach provides opportunity to tease out use preferences and technology viability before committing to higher fidelity design and integrated prototyping. Conducting early pre-formative evaluation and feasibility assessment on the foundational building blocks of a concept also helps identify product and workflow risks quickly and cost effectively, enabling concept refinement iterations to implement mitigations while the design is still flexible, thereby avoiding more costly rework in later stages of development. Executing early concept exploration work in this way involves thoughtful planning and close coordination between all stakeholder groups to lay out the research, testing, and prototyping sequence. Specifically for device engineers, this approach requires breaking down all the technical and user requirements of the potential concept solution space and prioritizing experimentation and rapid prototyping work to address areas of highest risk first. Outputs from these de-risking sprints are then reflected in the usability study workstream, following a progression of increasing prototype fidelity as needed to support the hypotheses being tested. By investing early in understanding the performance of a wide range of potential design feature configurations and feasible technology implementations, viable concept architectures will begin to present themselves as combinations of the most promising features from both a technical and usability perspective. Subsequently, further refinement and evaluation work allows for convergence towards an optimal integration of concept, function, and form, allowing the device architecture to be frozen confidently based on successful demonstration of risk reduction. Next slide. In conclusion, we'd like to highlight these takeaways from the discussion of the foundational method presented. It is important to explicitly define the risks to be mitigated from a user and technical perspective and use that approach to map out a plan. That plan should show key questions, sequencing of testing and model conditions, and expected outcomes and contingencies as needed. Planning in this manner is the most efficient way to build confidence in the product architecture, avoiding costly rework later in development. Thank you for your time and your interest in our poster, and Brian and I can take any questions you guys have on what we presented.
Great, thank you. You know, your topic is really in line with, you know, the design thinking movement exploding right now, where people are saying, you know, you gotta mock things up and get your hands on them earlier and earlier in the process. So this is a, you know, your visual is a great kind of representation of that movement. I think the challenge I wanted to ask you about is, so many companies are maybe willing to do that process with their device, but so resistant with their labeling and packaging with elements of a product that come usually so much later in the process. How do we shift industry into that exploration phase for all elements of their user interfaces?
That's a great question, and I'll let Brian chime in after me here, but I think one of the things I would stress most when getting into the early design work is that the packaging and labeling, the carton, the artwork, all of these elements should be considered almost the same as, you know, mechanical and engineering design elements to help reduce risk. They really should not be an afterthought. They shouldn't just follow marketing guidance. They should be considered as part of the overall system and the use experience to help drive correct use.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Just to expand on that, I think it's looking at the whole out-of-box experience, right? And it's everything from start to finish that someone's going to interact with. That needs to be explored earlier than later, and especially as products become more complex, technology is integrated, packaging and labeling is becoming more integrated as part of the product, and therefore it can't be treated the same way as it has in the past, and it needs to continue to be pulled up using the same methods to iterate as quick as possible on that you would, as you mentioned, the design thinking, you know, framework and process. Yeah,
and two things about this graphic. First, it's amazing. I know it's like a design in and of itself, right? So you put a lot of time into it. I love it. I think it's really innovative. And I also love your use of the word de-risk. Because, you know, if you just say to someone, you should do some formative or blah, blah, blah study, it doesn't resonate. But if you use the word de-risk, I think that gets people's attention, especially as risk management is actually what you're doing with the FDA. So I like the use of that term. That's very cool.
Yeah, absolutely. The goal here is is broad in that term, not just from, you know, risk assessment, but into a way to, you know, address technical challenges and explore. You can apply risk reduction in a number of ways for the project, for the device, for the use experience, and ultimately, you know, for a design that meets FDA risk mitigation.
Right. All right. Awesome. Thanks, guys. Great job.
Thanks,
And